This is Frankie Lynch, Saturn Girl. Please like my video and subscribe to my channel. Also, comment below. I want to know what you think, and it helps out with the algorithm. But we have sort of a challenging video for us to do today. You see, today, June 5th, 2023, Venus enters Leo, which means she's also opposing Pluto. This aspect, in fact, hard aspects of Venus to Pluto in general, often entail difficult subjects, sometimes even disturbing ones. So we're issuing a little content warning here because we'll be discussing Plutonian themes, including the events surrounding the criminal activities of the infamously evil human known as Jeffrey Epstein. As we get through these events, you'll see why they're important to go over. I think this is especially important, being a survivor myself, because we need to educate ourselves on what these aspects mean and what they tend to correlate with, so at least we can be better prepared for whatever comes our way. So, that being said, if you are squeamish or perhaps triggered by stories of abuse, or let's leave it there, maybe you should not watch this video. Also, I will be doing my best to adhere to YouTube's monetization policies. That means I will be censoring myself with certain words. For example, I will pause myself when using the S word in the context of these Plutonian events, right? So I'll be saying things like assault or activity, right? So you can see I'm saying, but I'm not, right? I'm not saying it. So it's almost like bleeping. Anyway, that's how we're going to do this. So let's get into it because we want this to be interesting. So like I said, today, Venus enters Leo. Well, I'm saying today, but I'm recording this today. I'm a little late here. You'll probably be watching this tomorrow or some other day, but this is still relevant. So don't turn it off. Anyway, so like I said, we'll see the effects of Venus opposite Pluto probably carrying over the next few days to a week. But what sort of things can we expect, or qualities emanating from this transit? Well, I've written down some notes to go over here. We talk about planetary significations on here all the time, but let's revisit them. So what is Venus, right? She's attraction and beauty, sexual desire, the organs of intercourse, as Vidius Valen says, or like I say, the naughty bits, the fun fluids, right? You know what I mean by fun fluids. Also, women and feminine things. Now remember, this video is educational. It's not meant to trigger anyone. Hopefully you find value in this, maybe from your own past and your own trauma, or perhaps being mindful and raising awareness of these sorts of issues that are still rampant and almost at epidemic levels in society. Anyway, let's continue. We mentioned Venus, but what's Pluto? Well, Pluto is domineering, isn't he? He's controlling and forcing, right? He's manipulative. He hoards wealth. In fact, he hides it. Pluto also rules things from under the earth. Precious metals and minerals, the valuable things. So, now what about oppositions? As we said in the past, oppositions are in the nature of Saturn. We won't explain what that means, but suffice it to say that it's the hardest aspect and represents protracted, prolonged, or repetitive struggles, right? That are persistent. That's the word, persistent struggles. Whereas Mars, the lesser benefic, is like, faster things. So squares will indicate quicker events. Whereas oppositions, they transpire over a period of time often. So anyway, what happens when these two come together in an opposition? Well, we see violence, right? Violence that targets our most intimate physical and psychological natures. You know what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about abuse. And we're not speaking of these things lightly, okay? Once again, I want to reiterate that we're doing this video, and I'm doing this video as a survivor and as an astrologer to raise awareness and call attention to these things. And plus, it's very interesting patterns and correlations we find here. One thing I've noticed from this placement is a propensity for stalking or being pursued in that way. People who are obsessively pursuing other people. We'll also see both predators and prey, the abusers and the survivors. We'll also see manipulation of spouses and partners, sometimes using money and sometimes using intimacy. I'm using that as a euphemism here. We'll also see pleasure from control and power, right? Venus is pleasure and Pluto's control and power. And it can get very dark. But there are very positive expressions of this too, right? People who are able to transmute great pain into amazing sensitivity. Oftentimes, these people have faced their own extraordinary traumas. And it can either lead someone to become bitter and manipulative themselves, or it can lead someone into greater compassion from processing such trauma. It can also be delightfully creepy and possessive for those who, like those sort of things. I have a couple exes with Pluto opposite Venus. And I really used to think that possessiveness was hot. One of them told me that they thought of me as their property. And I'm like, oh, that's so hot. But then you realize what that really means. So, well, anyway. So there are positive manifestations to this. Well, let's look at some examples here of famous people who have this aspect. Well, these people can be alluring. They can also be creepy. And like I said before, they can be survivors or they can be abusers. There's a real enchantment with Venus opposite Pluto people. I mean, I get weak in the knees and I don't even know that they have that aspect. And I just I don't know what it is. I just feel the Pluto-Venus thing and I turn into a simp. But it can be quite attractive. So Kurt Cobain had this aspect. And he's an example of someone who endured abuse. In fact, his parents got divorced. And then his mother married someone else who was abusive. So that means Kurt Cobain witnessed all this stuff as a child. In fact, he witnessed his mother suffer terrible things. One incident left her with a broken arm. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble, but we need to say these things. It's important. I still want to remain monetized on this, though. The social utility outweighs the monetization, I suppose. I keep having to justify myself here because of the nature of the topic. Well, it's so funny here because Courtney Love almost has Venus opposite Pluto. I mean, technically it is, but it's a really wide orb. She does have Pluto square Mars, though, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, Elvis Presley, everyone thinks of him as some wholesome character now. But according to Joel Williamson's 2014 biography on Elvis, titled Elvis Presley, A Southern Life, it's thoroughly described in there about how he had a penchant for very, very young girls and engaged in exploitation and with these young people. It's so hard mincing words and censoring myself, but it turns out he was a pretty disgusting human being. And then Napoleon Bonaparte, Venus opposite Pluto. He was infamously misogynistic. He famously said that women were inferior and that he despised them. He also said that it was their place to be subservient to men. Mahatma Ghandi, Venus opposite Pluto. Someone we revere in our hearts. Someone who stood up to power in the name of peace and nonviolence. In fact, allowing himself to be a punching bag. But what we very rarely talk about is his sordid past. In fact, Gandhi was even notoriously racist and held misogynistic views. He thought of white South Africans as superior. He made a quote that I can't quote here because it'll probably get me in trouble. He referred to menstruation as a corruption of the female soul. How up is that? He blamed women for their own victimization. He was a lawyer in South Africa. One case where a young man had been harassing women. He blamed the women for the harassment and said they needed to cut their hair so they would be less enticing. Ugh, this was Gandhi. And then he equated using contraceptives with prostitution. And sex work isn't bad. It's a very odd equation he made there. And then we have Madame Blavatsky, the famous Russian occultist who started the Theosophical Society. One of her fellow occultists, Mabel Collins, described her as manipulative and suggested that that's how she got influential and famous. But maybe Blavatsky was an abuse survivor herself. She was married off very young to this old toad named Blavatsky. Her maiden name was Helena Petrovna. So she could have very easily been a survivor. She later in life claimed to be a virgin and promoted celibacy, which is also very Pluto opposite Venus, because we have, on one hand, the licentious representation of just unbridled pursuit of pleasure. And on the other hand, we also have the extremely restrained or controlled or even, dare I say, prude expression. Now, it's very interesting, too, because there is speculation that she may have been queer. She was quite masculine and was even reported to wear men's attire when traveling. It's also suggested that she possibly had romantic interest in women, but there's no proof of that I'm aware of. That's all speculation based on indirect sources. Well, then we have Bhagawan Sri Osho Rajneesh, or who's known as just Osho. Famous spiritual guru who advocated openness about and liberation. However, there were many reports from his spiritual retreat from students and followers of his that they were often pressured to take part in acts, sometimes even forced. In fact, a lot of his students later exposed a whole underbelly of abuse. And to be quite honest, spiritual groups are very, very susceptible to abuse. Spirituality can be used as a justification for doing all sorts of nasty things to people. Of course, the main thing is intent. But let's say, there are many spiritual leaders throughout history that have been quite controlling, domineering, and used manipulation to keep their groups together. So, now, in my other video about the transits of June, we talk a little bit about this, and I mentioned some historical events that correlate with this aspect. Just briefly, I'll mention that on June 5th, 2018, this aspect perfected when Harvey Weinstein pled guilty. Sorry, when Harvey Weinstein pled not guilty to charges of assault, and you know what he did. I just can't say it out loud because YouTube will get mad. So this brings us to the Jeffrey Epstein saga. As I was researching this aspect, I sort of stumbled onto the fact that Pluto-Venus aspects seem to follow most, if not all, of the events surrounding his criminal activities, starting with the beginning of the first investigation into the nasty stuff he was up to, all the way up to his former girlfriend and accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, being sentenced. So we'll go through some of these things. And again, we'll talk a little bit about, his own chart and how Pluto-Venus aspects are not only representative of these events, but can indicate how we deal with these events, how we approach them, and what sort of susceptibility we may have to falling into these sorts of circumstances. So, number one, for those of you who don't recall, Jeffrey Epstein was a notoriously wealthy and well-connected abuser who for many years committed heinous crimes against young girls, and he helped many powerful and wealthy men do the same thing. Epstein's longtime girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, as I just mentioned, helped recruit victims. She was an accomplice. They were in a relationship, a romantic relationship for years, and she eventually became, quote, his best friend. So he was able to avoid prosecution many times because of how well connected he was. He knew lots of powerful people. His arrest, his final arrest in 2019, came before he was famously unalived in his cell. And there were a lot of strange circumstances surrounding that too. I mean, like the video cameras were turned off. He was unattended, I'm not a conspiracy person, but this is one of the instances where it's like, okay, like, who do you think you're fooling here? So, well, anyway, so many rich and powerful people were implicated in this scandal by associations or connections with Epstein. I mean, this is everyone from Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew of England, former President Donald Trump, Bill Gates, Kevin Spacey, Chris Tucker. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Sorry. And even Noam Chomsky recently was implicated. I mean, we don't have any evidence that Noam Chomsky did anything nefarious himself, but it is sort of, So anyway, the mysterious circumstances around Epstein's unaliving, as well as all the powerful connections and how little we know about the extent of the crimes that led to all kinds of speculation. But it sort of goes without saying at this point that rich and famous people from both sides of the American political spectrum were connected to Epstein and somehow involved with his activities. This wasn't localized to a political party. In fact, both sides were very, very much involved. Even one particular side that claims that they're trying to save the children. And yet they're all involved too. So, good job. Anyway, with this you can see that Pluto-Venus themes of power, abuse, exploitation, deception, and manipulation abound with all of these events, allegations, and testimonies. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about his biography and his chart really quick. So he was born in 1953 the son of immigrant parents from Eastern Europe. He went to NYU but dropped out. He was born in New York. But he did get a job around the age of 20 teaching at the prestigious Dalton School. It was a private elementary school, like a big, big deal, where all the rich elites and socialites of New York tried to get their kids into. Like the who's who of all the famous people in New York. Epstein made his connections here and eventually landed himself a job at the financial firm Bear Stearns, which you might remember from 2008 when it collapsed. So he was able to make very powerful connections with rich people and powerful people, and eventually himself became a high-ranking official, a limited partner, after being a salaried employee. That's a big deal. I wonder who he knew. Duh. So eventually he left Bear Stearns in 1981 after some illegal financial activities. And his exploits seem to really take off around this time when he leaves Bear Stearns. Well, we don't know Epstein's birth time, so we can't tell if he has Pluto aspecting an angle or something else, or if it doesn't rule anything to me, but you see what I'm saying, if it's in an angular house. But we don't have his birth time, so we don't know. And he doesn't have any other prominent Pluto aspects. So I wouldn't exactly call him Plutonian without seeing the rest of his chart, or knowing the houses rather. But he does have an exact conjunction between Mars and Venus in Pisces. So this is something that I do see a lot in charts with men making them a bit more effeminate and with women making them a bit more masculine. So it's sort of like a balancing of the gender expression. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about Jeffrey Epstein's taste and things like that, but I mean, he did seem like, he was a bit metro. Let's put it that way. A bit metro. He took good care of himself. And why is taking good care of yourself like a gendered thing? It's the stupidest thing. Anyway. So, now, this also can correlate with excessive desire. And sometimes even a brash approach to satisfying it. So, now Uranus is almost exactly trying these two. And he was into some really weird shit, obviously. So, now Jupiter is in Taurus in his chart. He would be having his Jupiter return right now. But Jupiter has mutual reception with Venus in Pisces. So this is probably indicating the luck with wealth and all that sort of stuff, because he just stumbled his way into high society, really. Although he was very intelligent. He was a math prodigy when he was younger. So even though colleagues said he sucked at investing and it was all just pretty much just like a cover, he was really good at planning and manipulating. So the other thing that we need to mention here is he did have some dysfunction, which psychologically could explain some of this. And maybe this has to do with the Mars conjunct Venus in Pisces thing. But according to some of his victims, his penis was a very weird shape, almost like an egg, they say, where it was like really fat towards the back and then got like skinny and pointed, almost like a teardrop at the front, and that he could never fully achieve, and he could never fully get. You understand what I'm saying here? So you see how that sort of psychology can it can lead people to some very interesting proclivities. I feel like I keep having to like dance around things and be so Libra. freaking YouTube. Jiminy Christmas. So anyway, well, let's look at some key events here in his whole activities that correlate with Pluto-Venus aspects. So like I mentioned before, the first investigation into his activities started in March 2005, when Venus was making a square to Pluto. Now, what happened was a woman called the Palm Beach Police Department and reported that her 14-year-old stepdaughter had been taken by an older girl to Epstein's Palm Beach mansion and paid to strip and give massages. And I say give massages with quotations here. You understand what I'm saying, right? So this investigation reveals that there were many, many victims, of course, underage. And this kicked off sort of a cascade of events that would eventually terminate in what happened in 2019. And we'll get there. But this is really interesting because we'll see the hard aspects, especially correlating with these investigations, with these events, and with either trying to manipulate or conceal situations like this. Whereas the trines and the sextiles, and sometimes even the conjunctions, will correlate with exposure and revealing these sorts of things. Oops, I just hit my mic. So then after this, we come to May 2006, when Venus was applying to a trine with Pluto. And this is when the Palm Beach Police Department charged Epstein with unlawful with a minor, and the Florida state attorney forwards the case to a grand jury, which is really unusual, and it's strange that he did that. So it sort of raised red flags, like, why is he doing this? So anyway, and that brings us to July of that same year, 2006. And this is when Venus was opposite Pluto, making an opposition. And a grand jury, who the state attorney forwarded this case to, only indicts him for soliciting prostitution. Not all the other stuff, like the really bad stuff. So police and the feds, they attack back at the state attorney, saying that he was going easy on Epstein, that he was giving special treatment. So the FBI starts its own investigation. This FBI investigation leads to a federal indictment in June of 2007, as Venus approaches a trine with Pluto. So you see the trine thing resulting in the federal indictment. Now, Epstein hires two lawyers, Alan Dershowitz and Ken Starr. You might remember these lawyers as the same ones hired by Donald Trump to address his impeachment proceedings following the January 6th incident. Now, the U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta would become the prosecutor in this case, and then later become Donald Trump's Secretary of Labor. Quite interesting. It's so funny because, there's a big effort to sort of label Trump as in opposition to all this stuff, when in fact he was actively participating. So, according to reports, a lot of these girls were in fact recruited and victimized at Mar-a-Lago. That's not coming from me. That's coming from testimony. And that brings us to June 2008, when Venus is separating from an opposition to Pluto. And the orb was a bit wide here, but it was separating from the aspect. So this is when Epstein pleads guilty to soliciting prostitution. And there was another count added by the FBI, soliciting from someone not of age. However, we talked about the opposition bringing not so nice stuff. And in this case, Alex Acosta, the federal prosecutor here, U.S. attorney, made a secret deal with Epstein that would grant him immunity from all of his previous federal crimes. That sounds a bit fishy, doesn't it? So this would come back to bite Acosta and, the whole administration in the behind. And in fact, this was even illegal because not even the victims were allowed to know the details. And that's their rights, to know the details of the outcomes of sentencing. Now, July 2009, this is when Venus is approaching an opposition to Pluto. And this is when Epstein is released from jail. All of his victims start filing lawsuits. November of 2018, we're fast forwarding here like 10 years now. And this is a Venus square to Pluto. Now, this is when the Miami Herald, a local newspaper in Florida, begins publishing stories exposing the Acosta-Epstein deal and really sort of attacking him for it. So, and then this brings us to the next year, July 6th of 2019. Now, this is when Venus was approaching an opposition to Pluto, and Epstein is finally arrested on trafficking charges, and Alex Acosta, formally resigns as Trump's Secretary of Labor after enduring a lot of criticism, rightfully so, for setting up a secret deal with Epstein. Now, so this brings us to July of 2020. Oh, I'm so sorry. We missed August of 2019. August of 2019 is when Epstein is found unalived in his cell. So, see, again, I have to be careful with all these phrases. Oh, goodness. Now, I didn't put that date in here because I couldn't find an exact Pluto aspect. You know what? I think I forgot something here. I think I forgot something here. We're just going to go look at this. 2019, and it was August. Yes. Well, Venus had left. Venus had left in opposition to Pluto several weeks before that. So, I mean, you can kind of make a case for it, but. Now, we then had, on July 2nd, July 2nd, 2020, federal crime charges are brought against Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, there wasn't a specific Pluto aspect with that one, but I had to mention that as just part of the timeline. Because then, December 30th of the following year, 2021, while Venus is conjunct Pluto, Maxwell is convicted of multiple charges relating to all this awful stuff. And then June 28th of 2022, when Venus is trine Pluto, that's when Maxwell is sentenced to 20 years in prison. Now, when I mention Venus trine Pluto, and I've got other videos on this, I talk about oftentimes bringing a resolution to these sorts of nasty events. Now, Maxwell being sentenced is definitely some sort of resolution in a way, but not nearly enough. This never actually came to a resolution. And you can think about this as still sort of festering under the surface, and in a way that alerts us to the nature of oppositions, because they seem to wear on. a square might just bump into us. An opposition festers, pulls at our strings, loosens our sanity, and wears us down. You can think of it like fault lines. Pressure just builds up until it finally, right? Well, anyway, this really isn't a resolution. There's still a lot we don't know. And it's very likely that wealthy and powerful people are carrying on like they always did, doing their same abusive habits. But at least from examining these events and the transits that correlate with them, we can get an idea of how to notice these patterns and to become aware of when things may not be right. Because oftentimes where there's smoke, there is fire. Now, of course, it's not all bad, right? Because these disgusting acts get exposed. And then we have to address them. Addressing things like this lifts consciousness. It raises awareness about this side of the human experience that a lot of us want to avoid. We can do things to prevent victimization, especially of children and underage people. So, we have an opportunity here to learn from these events. And this video is supposed to be an educational tool. So, what does this mean for us in society right now? Well, beyond all the other aspects of Pluto-Venus we mentioned earlier, we also see not just the exploitation of women, but trying to control their reproductive rights. We also see the victimization and suppression and control of trans people and gay people. So we can expect during this transit, and we already have, to see clashes between anti-LGBTQ activists or bigots with people who are trying to protect their rights. In fact, there was a violent confrontation in Los Angeles. Gosh, you think of California, right? But no, California is just as a prey to this as the rest of us. So we also hear a lot of stories now about mothers facing life-threatening circumstances during pregnancy in Texas, and that they try and access abortions, medical care to address their life-threatening situations, and doctors can't perform them. So also more and more anti-trans and LGBTQ propaganda. And we'll probably see more crimes be exposed. It's quite interesting to note that the Southern Baptist Church had a terrible scandal with abuse. And there are 3 main insurance companies that insure Protestant churches. And they report receiving around 260 abuse claims every year. That's terrible. Well, what does this mean for you personally, though? It's a time to stand up for yourself. If you're typically deferential and let people walk all over you, this is your time to feel empowered, to take back that sense of power, and to represent yourself, because no one else will. Now, relationships can sort of feel like a struggle to win or dominate each other during this transit. So it's time also to remember that relationships aren't about winning or keeping score. They're about love and practical relation to each other, about mutual support, growing together, and being supportive. Gosh, I just said mutual support, but you know what I mean. Being there for each other, sincerely, honestly, not just trying to take, or get what you can get. We'll see a lot of relationships where there's a really unhealthy relationship between one person taking and one person who's just addicted to giving, to their own detriment. So remember, we do see these sorts of people with this aspect too. So don't let yourself fall into the trap of control, right? Now, when going out, it doesn't mean don't go out, don't have fun, but be careful. Watch your beverages. Don't drink out of any strange toilets, as my auntie used to say. And don't go home with any people you don't know. You have to, when you go out with friends, people that you can trust, because you don't want to be incapacitated or not able to make rational decisions when there are people around you that don't have your best interest at heart. So I know all that sounds euphemistic, but just be careful. Try and go places with friends. That's the big theme. Now, on a positive note, you could be attracted to deviant romance, which is something that I'm very much interested in. Kink, right? Safe, sane, consensual between consenting adults, but, having some alternative fun, What I'm talking about, gosh. We're talking about safe, sane, and consensual fun. I shouldn't repeat myself, but I want to emphasize these points, especially for Plutonian people. A lot of people who follow me are Plutonian or Saturnian, and these sorts of things need to be borne in mind because we can't ever interfere with people's volition. In fact, that's a spiritual verity. That's a spiritual principle that you can't interfere with someone's volition. You can't interfere with someone's free will. Always, the choice must be voluntary. When you take that away from someone, you are not only committing a crime, but you're committing a spiritual offense. You're further separating yourself from people. And the whole notion of love is the practical realization of our interdependence with all people and all life in general. So I hope this has been informative. I hope this has been useful. And I hope this has been interesting. So once again, like the video, subscribe to my channel, look at all my information below. I give wonderful readings. And please, I hope you weren't triggered. And I hope you liked the video. And that maybe it was educational in some way. So, well, I love you. And you have a wonderful, whatever you're having. And now it's time to end the transmission.